Stand on the eastern bank of the Hudson River in Dutchess County, New York, and you will understand immediately why people have been building estates here for centuries. The river is wide and slow at this point, almost lake-like. It catches the light differently in the morning than in the afternoon. The Catskill Mountains sit on the far shore like a painted backdrop. The air carries the smell of old growth trees and turned earth. It is the kind of landscape that makes people want to stay, want to own, want to build something permanent. This place has a name that long predates any mansion. It is called Hyde Park. Before any Vanderbilt ever set foot here and before any railroad fortune touched this ground, Hyde Park was already one of the most admired estates in the Hudson Valley. Its story begins in 1764, when a physician named John Bard acquired a portion of a sprawling land grant called the Fauconnier Patent and began developing what he called his Hyde Park estate. He built a modest house along the Albany Post Road, laid out agricultural fields, and established a rhythm of refined country living that would define this land for the next century and a half. When John Bard's son Samuel inherited the property, he continued his father's work, deepening the estate's identity as a place of genteel cultivation, carefully tended grounds, and quiet prestige. The Bards were physicians, intellectuals, members of a class that valued learning alongside land. Their Hyde Park was not a display of wealth, it was a demonstration of character. Then, in 1828, a man named Dr. David Hosack purchased the estate and transformed it entirely. Hosack was a celebrated physician and horticulturalist, and he was determined to make Hyde Park into something extraordinary. He hired a Belgian landscape designer named André Parmentier. Together they reimagined the grounds as a picturesque landscape that drew admiring visitors from across Europe. Parmentier laid out terraces and carriage drives, planted specimen trees, created views that framed the river like paintings. His work was not merely gardening, it was theater on a landscape scale, and Hyde Park became famous for it. By 1840, the property had passed to the Astor family. John Jacob Astor, the fur trading and real estate magnate who had become one of the wealthiest men in America, purchased Hyde Park for his daughter Dorothea and her husband Walter S. Langden. Their son, Walter Langden Jr., later enlarged the existing house into a substantial Greek Revival mansion and continued improving the grounds. For decades, the Langden estate sat comfortably among the Hudson Valley's most desirable properties, polished, well-maintained, and deeply connected to the landscape Parmentier had shaped. But nothing stays the same. By the early 1890s, the Langden era was quietly ending. Walter Langden Jr. passed away in 1894. The property, though still beautiful, was beginning to feel like something between eras. The house was aging, a new century was approaching, and with it a different kind of wealth. Louder, larger, more self-conscious about what it wanted the world to understand. In May of 1895, Frederick William Vanderbilt and his wife Louise arrived. Frederick was 39 years old at the time of purchase. He was the grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man who had built one of the greatest transportation fortunes in American history, where the Commodore had started with a single ferry and scaled to a national railroad empire. Frederick had inherited a world already made. He was a director of 22 railroads. He had never known financial uncertainty in his life. What he was looking for at Hyde Park was not opportunity. It was a stage. He and Louise purchased the roughly 600-acre estate from the Langden heirs, drawn by the Hudson Valley scenery and by something more practical. The family's own railroad lines ran directly along the river. Hyde Park was, by the standards of the era, easily accessible from New York City. The same tracks that carried freight and commerce for the Vanderbilt Empire also carried Frederick and Louise to their spring and fall retreat in a matter of hours. The moment the purchase was complete, Frederick made a decision that says everything about what he intended. The existing Langden mansion, A substantial Greek Revival house that had stood as Hyde Park's centerpiece for decades was deemed structurally unsound. It was demolished. This was not a restoration, this was not a renovation, this was a replacement. Frederick Vanderbilt was not interested in inheriting someone else's aesthetic. He did not want to live inside the Langden family's idea of what a Hudson River estate should look like. He wanted to start from nothing and build his own statement from the ground up. He hired McKim, Mead & White, the most prestigious architectural firm in America. He gave them a clear brief: build something that looks like the ancestral seat of a European noble family. Not a house that a railroad director built in 1895, a house that could have been standing for 300 years, rooted in old money, old land, old power. And so, in the same year the Langden house came down, the drawings for a new mansion began to take shape on the drafting tables of McKim, Mead & White's New York office. The plans called for a Beaux-Arts structure of Indiana limestone, 174 feet long, 122 feet wide, 54 rooms spread across 4 floors. The frame would be structural steel, one of the most modern building technologies of the era, but the surface would speak entirely of permanence and tradition. Construction began almost immediately and continued through 1898. By spring of 1899, the interiors were complete, the furniture was in place, and Hyde Park was ready. But even before the first houseguest arrived, before the first formal dinner was served, before the gardens came into their full seasonal bloom, the shape of a question had already formed around this place, a question that the mansion's beautiful limestone facade would never quite answer. What is this house really for? It was too large for a couple with no children, too elaborate for the few weeks a year its owners actually stayed here, too dependent on the labor of dozens of people, most of whom would never be seen by the guests who move through its perfectly arranged rooms. It was a machine designed to produce a specific impression that the Vanderbilt fortune was not new money chasing old prestige, but something inevitable, something deserved, something as permanent as the river it overlooked. The Hudson kept moving, as it always had. The mansion stood above it, still and certain, waiting to be believed. When you approach the Vanderbilt mansion from the road, the first thing you notice is that you cannot really see it. A screen of tall pines and hemlocks lines the estate's boundary, planted deliberately to block the view from passing carriages and, later, passing cars. The house does not announce itself to strangers. It reveals itself only when it chooses to, only when you have passed through the gates, traveled the curving drive, and arrived at precisely the angle its designers intended. This was not an accident. It was architecture doing exactly what it was designed to do. McKim, Mead & White were the most celebrated architectural firm in America when Frederick and Louise Vanderbilt hired them in 1895. Charles Fallon McKim served as the principal architect on the project, while Stanford White played a central role in the interiors and the sourcing of antique European elements. Together, they had designed some of the most prominent buildings in the country, and they understood something important about what their clients wanted. Not just a house, but a specific kind of argument. The style they chose was Beaux-Arts, a French academic tradition that had become the preferred language of American Gilded Age ambition. Its grammar was unmistakable. Grand, symmetrical facades, flat, low-pitched roofs, prominent columns and pilasters, stone surfaces decorated with carved garlands and medallions. To an educated eye in 1898, a Beaux-Arts building said one thing above everything else. This was built by people with taste, with culture, with a connection to the great traditions of European civilization. This was precisely the argument the Vanderbilts needed to make. The family fortune had been built on railroads and commerce, raw industrial power, freight tonnage, rate manipulation, political leverage. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Frederick's grandfather, had been a man of enormous force and very little refinement, famous for his ambition rather than his cultivation. Now, a generation later, Frederick wanted the world to see something different. He wanted limestone and marble to say what money alone could not quite say, that the Vanderbilts had arrived, not just financially, but culturally. Under its Indiana limestone skin, the mansion is framed in structural steel and concrete, among the most modern building technologies available in the late 19th century, making the house virtually fireproof. This detail matters. The earlier Langden house had burned. Frederick was not going to build something that could be taken away by time or accident. The surface spoke of the past. The bones were built for the future. The mansion is approximately 174 feet long and 122 feet wide, with 54 rooms spread across 4 main floors. But understanding the building requires understanding not just how many rooms it contains, but how those rooms relate to each other. Because the plan of this house is not primarily about comfort, it is about choreography. The main floor follows a sequence that was standard in Beaux-Arts design, but here executed with particular precision. You enter into a central elliptical hall, oriented parallel to the river, with its polished surfaces and carefully placed objects signaling to every arriving guest that they have entered a different world. From this hall, the formal spaces branch outward, the grand dining room on one side, the large drawing room on the other, connected by north and south foyers, with the den, the gold room, and the grand staircase filling out the ceremonial ground floor. Every room leads logically to the next. Every view has been considered. Every piece of furniture, every carved ceiling panel, every marble column was placed with the understanding that guests would look at it and form a judgment. The second floor held the private world of the Vanderbilts themselves. Louise's suite, bedroom, boudoir, and bath was designed by Ogden Codman Jr. and occupied the most carefully appointed rooms in the house. Frederick's bedroom and bath sat nearby, along with guest rooms and a linen room. The third floor held additional guest bedrooms and then, past a door at the main staircase, a different world entirely. The servants' hall and staff quarters. That door was not merely a door, it was an architectural line, a physical declaration of where one world ended and another began. The basement was where the actual work of the house happened, and it was designed accordingly. The main kitchen, pantries, servants' lounge, servants' dining room, and male staff sleeping quarters all occupied this level, alongside boiler rooms and service corridors. From the kitchen, food traveled up to the dining room by dumbwaiter, an arrangement that served 2 purposes simultaneously. It reduced the sounds and smells of cooking from reaching the formal rooms above, and it allowed meals to arrive at precisely timed moments, as if conjured rather than prepared. Staff moved through an entirely separate system of back stairs and secondary corridors, appearing in the main rooms only when service required their presence, and disappearing again immediately afterward. An elaborate bell system connected the principal rooms to the servants' quarters and kitchen, a network of signals that allowed a guest to summon assistance with a quiet pull of a cord without raising their voice, without acknowledging that anyone was listening. Footmen and the housemen monitored these signals at all times, ready to respond before the guest had time to register that they had been waiting. The estate generated its own electricity from a hydroelectric plant on Crum Elbow Creek, a small waterway that ran through the property. This meant that when the surrounding area was still largely without electrical service, Hyde Park blazed with electric light. It also meant that the mansion depended on no one, no local utility, no outside infrastructure. The house was, as far as possible, its own self-contained world. Central heating, modern plumbing with multiple full bathrooms, telephone lines, dumbwaiters, bell systems, private electrical generation. Taken together, these technologies were not luxuries in the casual sense. They were instruments of control. They made it possible to run a 54-room house at a level of seamlessness that would have been impossible a generation earlier. They made it possible to host formal dinners for dozens of guests with the apparent effortlessness of people for whom everything had always been easy. This is the real achievement of the Vanderbilt mansion's architecture. Not the carved ceilings or the marble columns or the Indiana limestone facade, though all of those are genuinely extraordinary. The real achievement is the way the building manages two completely different experiences simultaneously. For guests, Hyde Park was a place of beauty, comfort, and seemingly effortless grace. Every surface polished, every meal perfectly timed, every room arranged as if the house maintained itself. For the people who actually maintained it, the experience was entirely different. They moved through a parallel architecture, narrower stairs, lower ceilings, plainer walls that existed within the same structure but was designed to remain invisible. The beauty above depended entirely on the system below. The effortlessness was, in fact, an enormous and carefully concealed effort. The mansion was not, in the end, a home in any ordinary sense. It was a machine for producing a specific impression, sustaining a specific illusion, and translating the profits of a railroad empire into the visual language of old-world permanence. It worked beautifully. That was precisely the problem. There is a number that tells you almost everything you need to know about the Vanderbilt mansion at Hyde Park. It is not the size of the house. 54 rooms, though that is striking enough. It is not the cost of building it. $660,000, which was already a remarkable sum in 1895. The number that matters most is this. The interior furnishings and decoration alone cost approximately $1.5 million. More than double the construction cost. More money spent on what went inside the walls than on the walls themselves. Think about that for a moment. The building, the steel frame, the Indiana limestone, the 4 floors, the grand staircase, the elliptical hall, was the cheaper part. What Frederick and Louise Vanderbilt spent on imported antiques, carved ceilings, tapestries, marble columns, custom reproductions, and period room installations dwarfed what they spent on the structure that held all of it. The shell was almost an afterthought. What they were really buying was an impression. In today's money, those combined costs, roughly $2.16 million in 1890s currency, translate to somewhere in the range of $70 million or more, depending on how you measure. But even that figure can be misleading because it treats the expenditure as if it were a sacrifice, as if the Vanderbilts stretched to afford it. For Frederick William Vanderbilt, this was discretionary spending, a fraction of a fortune he had not even primarily built himself. To understand the mansion, you have to understand where the money came from, and that story begins not with Frederick, but with his grandfather. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, started his working life with a single ferry on New York Harbor. Through a combination of relentless ambition, commercial instinct, and a willingness to operate in ways that his competitors found alarming, he built that ferry into a steamship empire and then turned that empire into something larger still. In the middle decades of the 19th century, he began acquiring and consolidating railroads, most significantly the New York Central. By the 1870s, the New York Central system was the largest business enterprise in the United States, and the Vanderbilt family controlled a substantial share of American rail mileage. This was also a time before antitrust regulation existed in any meaningful form, a time before permanent federal income tax, a time when the rules that constrained the accumulation of wealth had simply not yet been written. The Commodore operated in a world where the distance between ambition and monopoly was short and where there was no mechanism to redirect much of what he earned back to the public that depended on his lines. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he left an estate of approximately $100 million, one of the largest private fortunes America had yet seen. The bulk of it went to his son, William Henry. When William Henry died in 1885, he had grown that inheritance to roughly $200 million, and he reportedly said that such an amount was too large for any single person to hold. Frederick received approximately $10 million from his father's estate, in addition to the $2 million he had already received when the Commodore died. Over the following decades, through careful railroad directorships and quiet investment, he grew his personal fortune to roughly $70 million by the time of his own death in 1938. Frederick was the third son of William Henry Vanderbilt. He was not the primary heir. He was not the most prominent member of his generation. He trained at Yale's Sheffield Scientific School, graduated in 1876, and went into the family business, serving on the boards of 22 railroads over the course of his career, including the New York Central. By the standards of his family, he was considered modest, even understated. He avoided the headlines that other Vanderbilts generated. He did not build palaces on Fifth Avenue or throw legendary balls that filled the society pages for weeks. He preferred gardening, yachting, and what contemporaries described as quiet, competent management. And yet this modest man built a $2.16 million estate for two people. The contradiction is worth sitting with. Frederick cultivated an image of restrained practicality, a businessman, not a showman, while simultaneously commissioning one of the most elaborate Beaux-Arts mansions in America and filling it with European antiques that cost more than the building itself. The estate was not a contradiction of his character, it was an extension of it. Frederick understood perhaps more clearly than his flashier siblings that permanent prestige did not come from spectacle, it came from stone, from landscape grounds that looked centuries old, from rooms that looked as though they had been inherited rather than purchased. Louise understood this too, in her own way. She had come from a prosperous but not aristocratic background. She had been married before, to Frederick's cousin, and had divorced him, a scandalous step in the 1870s, before marrying Frederick in 1878 over the initial objections of his family. She had spent years earning the approval of the Vanderbilt inner circle, and when she finally won it, she did not waste it. At Hyde Park, she became the hostess of a house that was designed to make everyone inside it feel that they were guests of something older and more permanent than a railroad fortune. The farm supplied the household with eggs, meat, dairy, vegetables, and flowers, both at Hyde Park and at the Vanderbilt's New York townhouse. Prize-winning animals and produce were entered at local fairs, winning ribbons that Frederick habitually gave away to the estate staff as small cash awards. The self-sufficiency of the estate was itself a statement. The Vanderbilts did not need the town. The estate generated its own electricity, grew its own food, and employed its own workforce. It was a world that operated by its own logic, on its own terms. Over 60 people worked full-time to maintain it. Chambermaids earned between $18 and $25 per month. Footmen earned $30 to $40. Laundresses earned around $30. The housekeeper earned between $50 and $150. The chef commanded between $100 and $180 per month. These were not unusual wages for elite domestic service in that era, but they were wages paid by people who, in the same period, spent $1.5 million dollars on interior decoration and never once had to consider whether they could afford to. That distance between what the mansion cost and what the people who ran it earned is not a footnote to the story of Hyde Park. It is the story. The fortune that built this house came from an era without income tax, without meaningful labor protections, without antitrust enforcement, and without any serious mechanism for redirecting the profits of railroad monopoly back into the communities those railroads served. The limestone facade, the carved ceilings, the private hydroelectric plant on Crum Elbow Creek, all of it rested on that foundation. Beautiful things often rest on uncomfortable foundations. Hyde Park makes that visible if you know where to look. The mansion had 54 rooms. At any given time during the Vanderbilt's seasonal visits, perhaps 2 of those rooms were actually being lived in by the people the house was built for. Frederick had his bedroom and bath. Louise had her suite, bedroom, boudoir, and bath, designed by Ogden Codman Jr. with the kind of careful attention to personal comfort that makes a room feel genuinely inhabited rather than merely staged. The other 50-something rooms existed for display, for guests, for the rituals of elite social life. And behind all of them, below them, running through them in a parallel network of corridors and staircases invisible to arriving guests, was the real engine of Hyde Park. More than 60 people working every day to make 2 people comfortable for a few weeks each year. This is the part of the story that the limestone facade does not tell you. At the height of the estate's operation, the workforce at Hyde Park was organized with the same precision as the architecture itself. 17 people worked inside the mansion. 2 more staffed the pavilion. 44 additional workers maintained the grounds, the farm, the greenhouses, the stables, the carriage house, and the hydroelectric plant on Crum Elbow Creek. 13 men alone tended the gardens and lawns, cutting, planting, trimming, and maintaining the manicured landscape that guests admired from the mansion's west-facing windows. When the Vanderbilts hosted large house parties, they hired additional cooks and maids from the town of Hyde Park, temporarily expanding an already substantial workforce. On those occasions, the invisible army grew larger still. Inside the house, the staff were organized into departments, each with its own hierarchy. The housekeeper supervised 4 chambermaids, a parlor maid, and 3 or 4 laundresses. The butler oversaw 2 footmen and the houseman. The chef directed 2 cooks and a kitchen maid. A valet attended Frederick. Personally, a lady's maid attended Louise. Each of these people had a specific domain, a specific set of tasks, and a specific understanding of where they were permitted to go and when. The chambermaids rose before the family. They cleaned the halls and staircases first, the parts of the house that guests would see during the day, and then moved to the bedrooms and bathrooms after the Vanderbilts had left those rooms for the morning. A chambermaid named Teresa Farley, who worked at Hyde Park around the turn of the century, was assigned to the basement, the housekeeper's rooms, the upstairs maid's lavatory, and the grand staircase. That last assignment is worth pausing on. The grand staircase was the ceremonial spine of the house, the architectural feature that guests descended for dinner, that photographers captured, that every visitor noticed. Keeping it polished and perfect was Teresa Farley's responsibility. Her labor was embedded in the most visible surface of the entire building, and her name appears nowhere on any wall inside it. A man named Thomas Morgan served as houseman at Hyde Park from around 1900 to 1909, earning $45 per month, slightly above the typical range for the position. He later recalled Frederick Vanderbilt's habit of long absorbed tours of the grounds with the estate superintendent, describing the owner's close attention to his gardens and his pride in the condition of his land. Morgan's recollections offer one of the rare detailed windows into daily life at Hyde Park, from the perspective of someone who worked there, the livery he was required to wear, the tasks he was assigned, the rhythms of a workday that began before the family woke and ended after they retired. The houseman's duties included tending the furnaces, delivering firewood, cleaning windows, and running errands throughout the estate. The laundresses managed the expensive linens that filled the mansion's many bedrooms and dining rooms, building fires, maintaining boilers, washing, pressing, and folding fabrics that cost more than a chambermaid earned in several months. The cooks prepared meals for both the family and the guests, adjusted menus for large entertainments, and then turned around and fed the staff as well, all in a basement kitchen that the guests above never saw and rarely thought about. Wages were in line with what high-end domestic service paid in that era. Chambermaids and parlormaids earned between $18 and $25 per month. Laundresses earned around $30. Footmen and the housemen earned $30 to $40. The housekeeper earned between $50 and $150. The chef, at the top of the domestic hierarchy, commanded between $100 and $180 per month. Room and board were provided. The family supplied livery, the uniforms that made staff instantly identifiable and simultaneously erased their individuality in public rooms. The hours were long and the autonomy was limited. Maids typically had a couple of hours off each day, one free afternoon and evening per week, and half of every second Sunday. The rest of the time belonged to the house and to whoever was in it. Privacy was minimal for live-in workers whose bedrooms were in the basement or the upper reaches of the third floor, separated from the guest bedrooms by a door at the main staircase, a physical boundary that made the division between the world of leisure and the world of labor as literal as any architectural feature in the building. The staff did not call themselves servants. They called themselves the help. It was a distinction that mattered to them, an assertion of dignity inside a system that had not been designed with their dignity in mind. By most accounts, they described the Vanderbilts as very democratic employers, approachable and not given to the haughtiness that characterized some Gilded Age households. Frederick redistributed small cash prizes he won at local agricultural fairs directly to the estate workers. Louise remembered names, sent flowers to the sick, and involved herself in local charitable work that benefited some of the same families who sent their members to work at Hyde Park. These gestures were real. They were also gestures made from a position so far above the people receiving them that the gap barely registered in the accounts of the era. Because here is the fact that sits beneath all the carefully maintained surfaces of Hyde Park. The Vanderbilts visited for a few weeks in spring and a few weeks in autumn. The rest of the year, the months of winter when the house was cold and the Hudson was frozen, the long summer weeks when Frederick and Louise were at Newport or the Adirondacks or aboard their yacht, 60 people remained at Hyde Park, keeping it ready, maintaining the grounds, running the farm, tending the greenhouses so that there would be fresh flowers on the dining table whenever the family returned. The mansion did not wait for the Vanderbilts. The mansion was never empty. It was simply occupied by different people whose names are harder to find, whose hours were longer, and whose experience of those 54 rooms was nothing like the one the house was designed to produce. Every great house of the Gilded Age was, in a sense, a theater. The rooms were the stage, the guests were the audience, and the performance, the dinners, the conversations, the carefully timed arrivals and departures, was the real product of all that. Architecture, all that money, all those invisible workers in the basement and behind the walls. At Hyde Park, the director of that performance was Louise. Frederick Vanderbilt was, by every contemporary account, a quiet man. He preferred his gardens to his drawing room, his estate superintendent's company to that of visiting industrialists, his morning inspections of the grounds to the rituals of formal entertaining. He was competent, reserved, and genuinely modest by the standards of a family not known for modesty. Left entirely to his own inclinations, Hyde Park might have been a very private place, a gentleman farmer's retreat seen by few and spoken of even less. Louise made it something else entirely. She had come to the Vanderbilt family as an outsider, and she never forgot it. Born into a prosperous but not aristocratic background, a merchant's family, she had been married before to Frederick's cousin Alfred Torrance and had divorced him, a decision that carried real social cost in the 1870s. When she and Frederick married in 1878, his family objected. The Vanderbilts were protective of their name and careful about who entered their circle. Louise was not the obvious choice. She spent years changing that. Through patience, social skill, and a genuine gift for the rituals of elite life, she eventually won over William Henry Vanderbilt, Frederick's father, who came to consider her one of his favorites. By the time Hyde Park was completed in 1899, Louise had not merely been accepted, she had become one of the most accomplished hostesses in Hudson Valley society. The mansion was her instrument, and she played it with complete fluency. The rhythm of the Hyde Park social season followed the logic of the Gilded Age elite calendar. Spring arrived first, typically, from April until the first truly hot days of summer, when Frederick and Louise would open the house, receive guests, and let the estate show itself at its freshest. The Hudson Valley in April and May has a particular quality of light, and the terraces and carriage drives that André Parmentier had laid out in the 1820s, reshaped and elaborated under Frederick's direction, were designed to capture it. Then the family moved on, to Newport for summer, to the Adirondacks, to their yacht on open water. Hyde Park waited for them. Fall brought them back, from roughly September through November, for a second season of cooler air, turning leaves, and a landscape that looked almost painted against the river. This was the circuit of a specific kind of life, one that moved between houses according to season, climate, and social calendar, maintaining multiple establishments simultaneously and appearing at each in a state of effortless readiness that required behind the scenes enormous coordinated effort. When guests arrived at Hyde Park, they came by private rail car along the family's own New York Central lines, by boat to the estate's dock, or by automobile along the carefully screened driveway. They were received in the elliptical hall and moved through a sequence of spaces: the drawing room, the den, the gold room, each arranged to produce a specific impression of cultivated taste and inherited comfort. Slightly slower. Guest rooms in the mansion and in the pavilion accommodated visiting couples along with their own personal staff, ladies' maids, valets, because arriving at a house like Hyde Park without your own attendant would have been a social statement in itself. 13 rooms on the third floor were set aside for the servants of guests, an arrangement that gives you some sense of the scale of what a weekend visit to the Vanderbilts actually involved. The formal dinners in the grand dining room were the center of social life at Hyde Park. The table settings were composed with the same attention to detail as everything else in the house: flowers from the estate greenhouses, selected personally by Louise regardless of season, arranged to complement the carved ceiling and the marble columns that framed the room. The butler and chef choreographed the pacing of multiple courses, timing each remove and each wine to reinforce the impression that dinner at Hyde Park unfolded with the natural grace of a place where things had always been done this way. On Saturday evenings, the dancing that sometimes followed dinner stopped at midnight out of respect for the Sabbath. This small detail, a social rule observed in a house built on a fortune that had not always operated by the most scrupulous rules, is one of those moments where the surface of Gilded Age propriety and the complexity beneath it become briefly visible at the same time. Beyond the private entertainments, Louise organized events that opened the estate, at least partially, to the broader community of Hyde Park. The most notable was an annual strawberry and ice cream festival for local children and families, a gathering that positioned the Vanderbilts as benevolent figures in the life of the town, as people who remembered where they were and who their neighbors were. She supported local churches, donated flowers to hospitals, funded education for young women, helped bring public health nursing to the community, and brought the Red Cross to town. These were genuine acts, done by someone who appears to have believed in them. They were also acts that reinforced something. The distance between the woman distributing strawberries and ice cream on the lawn and the families receiving them was not incidental, it was structural. The charity moved in one direction. The labor, the deference, the invisible maintenance of the house and grounds moved in the other. Benevolence and hierarchy were not in tension at Hyde Park. They were two parts of the same arrangement. It is also worth remembering what Hyde Park was not. Later accounts sometimes imagine the estate as a place of constant balls and glittering seasons, a non-stop parade of Gilded Age spectacle. The surviving records suggest something quieter and in some ways stranger. The Vanderbilts used the house modestly in terms of time, even if lavishly in terms of style. Many days at Hyde Park were simply days. Frederick walking the grounds with his superintendent, Louise overseeing the household, a small staff moving through familiar routines in rooms that were largely empty of guests. Frederick and Louise had no children. There were no young people running through. The halls, no next generation learning the names of the rooms or the habits of the house. The estate was designed to read as an inherited seat, as a place with roots, with continuity, with a family history woven into its walls. But the family that lived there was a couple, growing older, with no one to pass it to. In 1926, Louise died. She was 82 years old. Frederick continued. He remained at Hyde Park and at his other properties, growing quieter each year. The performance that Louise had directed with such skill did not simply continue in her absence, it diminished. The house that had been designed to project abundance, to stage the rituals of an entire social world, quietly changed its character. The stage was still set. The audience had largely gone home. Louise Vanderbilt died in 1926. She was 82 years old. The woman who had turned Hyde Park into one of the most polished houses on the Hudson River, who had personally selected flowers from the greenhouses for the dining table, organized the annual Strawberry Festival for local children, presided over formal dinners in the grand room with its carved ceiling and marble columns, was gone. And with her went something that no amount of careful maintenance could replace. Frederick was 70 years old when he lost her. He continued living. He continued managing the estate. The grounds were kept. The farm ran. The hydroelectric plant on Crum Elbow Creek still generated electricity for the mansion and its outbuildings. But the house that had been designed to project abundance, to stage the rituals of an entire social world, quietly changed its character. A 54-room mansion built for display becomes a different kind of place when the person who understood its social purpose is no longer there to direct it. The final years of Frederick's life at Hyde Park are documented in small, telling details. He began spending most of his time on the third floor, the floor that had always housed the servants' quarters, separated from the guest bedrooms by a door at the main staircase. He directed the affairs of the estate largely from his bedroom. The enormous public rooms below, the elliptical hall, the drawing room, the grand dining room, sat largely unused. The shell remained immaculate. The life inside it had contracted to almost nothing. This was not poverty. Frederick's fortune continued to grow even through the turbulent years that followed the stock market collapse of 1929, an era that ended or severely damaged the financial foundations of many other Gilded Age households. While families across America dismantled their great estates, selling off land, in pieces, auctioning furniture, releasing servants, and abandoning houses they could no longer afford to heat, Hyde Park remained intact. Its grounds were maintained. Its staff, somewhat reduced from the peak years, continued working. The house did not fall apart. It simply outlived its original purpose. The world around it had changed in ways that made what Hyde Park represented feel increasingly like a relic. Federal income and estate taxes, which had not existed in any serious form when the Vanderbilt fortune was being assembled, were now permanent features of American financial life. Labor markets were shifting. The supply of people willing to spend their lives in domestic service at Gilded Age wages was contracting as urban industries offered different kinds of work. The social attitudes that had once made a 60-person estate staff seem natural were being questioned more openly with each passing decade. And yet Hyde Park held on, maintained by the sheer weight of Frederick's fortune and his personal attachment to the land. He had always loved the grounds more than the rooms. his long morning inspections with the estate superintendent, his pride in prize-winning vegetables and livestock, his careful management of the planted landscape that ran from the mansion terrace down toward the Hudson. Even in his final years, that attachment did not leave him. Frederick William Vanderbilt died at Hyde Park on June 29, 1938. He was 82 years old. His estate was valued at nearly $80 million. He had grown his original $10 million inheritance to approximately $70 million through decades of careful railroad directorships and investment, even as the world around him transformed beyond anything his grandfather had imagined possible. His will directed large philanthropic bequests to universities and charitable institutions and left Hyde Park, the mansion, its furnishings, the remaining land, and a substantial share of the residual estate, to his niece, Margaret Van Allen, known within the family as Daisy. She had no particular connection to the rhythms of the estate, to the seasonal openings and closings, to the complex choreography of 60 workers maintaining a house for a couple who visited for a few weeks each year. She tried briefly to sell it. No buyer came. This is one of the most quietly significant facts in the entire story of Hyde Park. A 54-room Beaux-Arts mansion on 600 acres of Hudson River frontage, furnished throughout with antiques and European period rooms that had cost $1.5 million to assemble, and in the late 1930s, no private individual was willing or able to take it on. The economic system that had made such a place possible, the railroad monopolies, the tax-free accumulation, the unlimited supply of inexpensive domestic labor, was no longer in place. And without that system, a house like Hyde Park was not an asset. It was an obligation. Franklin D. Roosevelt intervened. Roosevelt was at that moment the President of the United States, and he was also, in a very particular sense, a neighbor. His own family home, Springwood, sat just a few miles south along the same stretch of Hudson River. He knew Hyde Park. He understood what it was and what it represented, and he had a clear view of what he thought should happen to it. At Roosevelt's urging, Margaret Van Allen donated the mansion, most of its original furnishings, and approximately 200 acres of the estate to the federal government in 1940. Her stated intention was that it should serve as a memorial to her uncle and a national monument, a way of ensuring that Frederick's name and his house would outlast the era that had produced them. Congress authorized Vanderbilt Mansion National Historic Site in December of 1940. The site opened to the public for tours in July of that same year, making it one of the earliest Gilded Age estates to be preserved under federal stewardship. Almost immediately, the spaces that had been designed for the private enjoyment of the Vanderbilts and their invited guests became accessible to anyone who wanted to walk through them. During the Second World War, the transformation of the house's purpose became almost literal. Secret Service agents assigned to protect President Roosevelt, whose home at Springwood was nearby, were housed in the mansion's basement and third-floor service areas, the same spaces that had once held the kitchen, the servants' lounge, the laundress's quarters, and the staff bedrooms. The rooms, designed for invisible labor, became quarters for government security personnel. The rooms designed for elite display sat largely quiet above them. The 600 acres that Frederick had assembled, the farms, the woodlands, the river frontage, the outlying structures, were not all preserved. The National Historic Site retained approximately 211 acres at its core: the mansion, the pavilion, the coach house, the powerhouse, the formal gardens, and the surrounding landscape. The rest dispersed. The estate that had been designed as a self-contained world was permanently reduced to a portion of itself. What remained was enough. Enough limestone, enough carved ceilings, enough period rooms and manicured terraces to make the argument the building had always been designed to make. The difference was that now it made that argument to everyone, not just to the invited guests who had arrived by private railcar and been received in the elliptical hall, but to school children and tourists and anyone else who bought a ticket and walked through the door. The house had survived. The world that built it had not. The Hudson River does not care about any of this. It was moving before John Bard built his first house on the eastern bank in 1764. It was moving when Frederick and Louise Vanderbilt arrived in 1895 and commissioned the most prestigious architectural firm in America to build them something that would last. It was moving when Louise died in 1926, when Frederick withdrew to his third-floor bedroom and let the great public rooms sit largely empty below him, when he died on June 29, 1938, and when Margaret Van Allen signed the papers that transferred the house to the federal government in 1940. It is still moving now. Today, the Vanderbilt Mansion is a national historic site operated by the National Park Service and open to anyone who wants to walk through it. Visitors purchase tickets at the Pavilion, the same guest cottage that once housed the overflow of invited elites arriving by private railcar, and enter the mansion only with a ranger-led guided tour. The grounds are open for self-guided exploration from dawn to dusk. You can walk the same carriage drives that Frederick inspected on his long morning rounds. You can stand on the terrace and look out at the same river view that Louise's guests admired from the drawing room windows. For much of the mid-20th century, the mansion was presented largely as a monument to artistic achievement and Gilded Age refinement. Tours emphasized the furnishings, the architectural details, the evident taste of people who had spent $1.5 million on interior decoration in the 1890s. The servants were a footnote. The railroad monopolies were not discussed. The question of what it cost, in human terms, not just financial ones, to produce and maintain this level of refinement was largely left aside. That has changed. The National Park Service now frames Vanderbilt Mansion explicitly as a case study in the economic, social, and cultural dynamics of the Gilded Age. Tours and educational materials increasingly highlight staff hierarchy, domestic labor, the daily routines of workers like Thomas Morgan and Teresa Farley, the wages chambermaids earned compared to what the family spent on antiques. Publications have noted a broader shift in how mansion museums approach their subject, a growing willingness to reveal the grittier side of what these houses actually were and how they actually functioned. But the house still does what it was designed to do. The beauty has not changed. You stand in the elliptical hall, and the polished surfaces and carefully placed objects still produce their intended effect. The discomfort, when it comes, arrives quietly, in the detail about the wages, in the mention of the door that separated the guest bedrooms from the servants' quarters, in the arithmetic of 60 workers maintaining a house for 2 people who visited for a few weeks each year. These facts do not shout. They sit alongside the carved ceilings and the marble columns and ask you to hold 2 things in your mind at once. Frederick Vanderbilt turned a $10 million inheritance into a fortune of roughly $70 million. He served on the boards of 22 railroads. He built a mansion that cost $660,000 to construct and $1.5 million to furnish. He employed more than 60 people full-time to maintain it. He visited for a few weeks each spring and a few weeks each autumn. He had no children. When Sai Kao, he died, no one could afford to continue what he had built. No buyer came. The house was given away. The names of the Vanderbilts are on every interpretive panel. The name of Teresa Farley, who cleaned the grand staircase every morning, is not on any wall. The name of Thomas Morgan, who tended the furnaces and ran errands for $45 a month, does not appear anywhere a visitor would encounter it without specifically looking. The limestone still stands above the river. The tour groups move through the elliptical hall. The Hudson keeps moving, the way it always has, carrying everything downstream and remembering nothing. Some things a house preserves. Some things it quietly lets go.